Imagine getting a $500 fine simply because you fell asleep in your own car. Or, picture being legally forced to turn off your vehicle's heater after exactly 15 minutes, even if it is sub-freezing outside.
Yeah, for a lot of people, those aren't hypothetical scenarios at all. In parts of Delaware, that is the literal documented cost of just trying to survive the night without a roof over your head.
Right. Which is exactly why we are doing this. The experience of homelessness isn't this single, monolithic, nationwide issue. It's a hyper-local maze of laws, systems, and, well, geography. What works in one part of the country might literally get you arrested in another.
Exactly.
So for this deep dive, we're embarking on a pretty massive mission. We are building a real-time, documentary-style scorecard for the state of Delaware.
And we are not just going to, hand you a number right out of the gate. We are going to build this evaluation category by category.
Yeah.
So the score will evolve dynamically throughout our conversation as we look at how this specific state handles its housing crisis.
So as you listen, you'll hear how different policies raise or lower the grade piece by piece. It's really a journey to understand the actual lived reality on the ground. But before we get into the 6 individual metrics of our scorecard, we really need to understand the scale of the crisis in Delaware right now.
Yeah, to understand the scale, we have to look at the state's point in time, or PIT count data. This is, it's an annual effort to count every unhoused person on a single night.
And the trajectory is pretty steep, right?
Very steep. In 2025, Delaware hit a historic high of 1,585 unhoused individuals. That represents a 16% jump from the previous year alone.
Wow. And when you dig into who actually makes up that number, it really shatters a lot of the stereotypes people might hold. Roughly 50% of those surveyed are either under the age of 18 or over the age of 55.
It's an incredibly vulnerable population. You're looking at children and seniors making up half the crisis. On top of that, 41% report having a disability. But the demographic data also reveals these really severe systemic inequities. Black Delawareans represent 65.5% of the unhoused population, despite making up only 24% of the state's total population.
We really need to pause on that for a second because it's a massive disparity. Why are we seeing such a disproportionate impact there?
It basically comes down to a compounding of historical and systemic factors. When you look at decades of redlining, persistent wage gaps, and a lack of generational wealth.
The safety net just isn't there.
Exactly. Black communities are often left far more vulnerable to sudden economic shocks. So if a medical emergency or a rent hike happens, there isn't always a financial safety net to fall back on, which just accelerates the pipeline to homelessness.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We are also tracking a geographic shift right now. The unhoused population is migrating southward, away from the urban center of Newcastle County, down toward the more rural and coastal areas of Kent and Sussex counties.
Speaking of where people are located, what blew my mind in the research was this highly publicized claim made by Wilmington's mayor. He publicly stated that Philadelphia was busing homeless people into Delaware.
Oh, right. That claim.
You dug into the actual survey data on this.
Yeah.
Unpack what you found, because the numbers completely dismantle that narrative.
They really do. The data tells a drastically different story. Because of that specific claim, organizers actually added an origin tracking question to the 2026 survey in Wilmington to see where people were, actually coming from.
And what did they find?
It turns out 45% of surveyed individuals grew up in Wilmington. Another 24% became homeless after they had already moved there.
Wait, really?
Yeah. When they surveyed a major downtown shelter, only 4 people out of the entire group said they were homeless in Philly before coming to Wilmington.
So the overwhelming majority are local residents. It is a homegrown crisis, not an imported one.
Exactly.
That context sets the stage perfectly for the first category on our scorecard, which is housing affordability.
Right, and this metric exposes a severe systemic bottleneck in Delaware. In 2024, the Central Intake Hotline for Housing Alliance Delaware, which is basically the main artery for getting emergency housing assistance, received calls from 7,131 desperate households.
Okay.
Out of those thousands of calls, only 952 were successfully referred to help.
That is just 13.3%, meaning over 86% of households calling a state homelessness hotline are essentially told, well, we have absolutely nothing for you.
Nothing at all.
And if you're listening to this thinking, wait, aren't there jobs available? Let's look at the lived reality of the working homeless down in those southern coastal counties you mentioned earlier.
The math simply does not work for them. Down along the coastal highway, you have people working retail or service jobs supporting the tourism industry. They might be making $15 an hour, which, sounds decent on paper.
Yeah.
But because those jobs are highly seasonal, they might only get about 1,000 hours of work a year. That is $15,000 annually before taxes. That income cannot even begin to cover local market rate rents in coastal communities.
And dedicated workforce housing is essentially non-existent.
Exactly.
It reminds me of a brutal game of musical chairs. You have all these working people circling the chairs doing exactly what society asks of them.
But the moment the music stops, 86% of the players are left standing because there simply aren't enough affordable units built.
Exactly. And the burden instantly shifts from the housing market directly to the streets. Because of this massive gap in affordable options, this lowers the overall picture.
Which logically forces us to look at the next safety net. I mean, if 86% of working people are locked out of the permanent housing market, they are instantly pushed into a state of emergency. Where do they sleep tonight?
Right.
That brings us to the second category on our scorecard, shelter access.
So for the vast majority who are turned away from permanent placement, what does that emergency safety net actually look like in Delaware?
Well, it is heavily restricted and very conditional. The state operates an emergency motel voucher system through the Department of Health and Social Services, but it comes with a strict cap of $1,200 annually per household.
Annually. Furthermore, it's primarily linked to specific criteria, like families receiving TNF benefits, which is the state's Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, or domestic violence survivors.
I mean, a $1,200 annual cap doesn't buy you much time in a motel at current nightly rates. A week. Maybe 2 weeks if you find a really cheap place.
Barely 2 weeks. And once that is exhausted, you have to look at the Code Purple shelters. These are emergency winter sanctuaries that open up across the state.
Okay, that sounds better.
They are absolute life-saving measures, but they are entirely weather-dependent. They only open their doors when temperatures drop to freezing or below.
So the entire system is built on reacting to immediate weather threats rather than, providing consistent, reliable shelter. What happens when the weather warms up?
The Code Purple shelters close, the funding and the volunteer hours dry up, and people are forced right back out into the woods or into their vehicles.
It's just a temporary Band-Aid on a chronic wound. With strict financial caps and a reliance on seasonal weather triggers, this shifts the score. And now we have to address the reality of what happens when the shelters are full or when it's, say, 40 degrees outside and Code Purple isn't active.
Right. Which brings us to our third category, criminalization and enforcement. This is where the lived reality gets incredibly intense. If you can't afford rent and the state has no shelter beds for you, your only option is to exist in public.
Exactly.
But existing in public has become a legal minefield.
Oh, absolutely. Delaware presents a very harsh municipal maze for the unhoused. We see local towns enacting highly punitive ordinances. Georgetown, for instance, has a complete ban on sleeping in cars or occupying vehicles as sleeping quarters on any street.
Wow.
Down in Fenwick Island, they ban vehicle occupancy in public spaces from midnight to 6 in the morning, and violating that can hit you with a $500 fine.
A $500 fine for someone who literally cannot afford a place to sleep. It just guarantees they will never save enough for a security deposit.
Precisely. And up north in Wilmington, they enforce rules requiring all 4 tires to be within 12 inches of the curb, and they heavily penalize parking near crosswalks or fire hydrants.
Into the trap.
It is. The sheer volume of technical rules makes it incredibly easy to get your vehicle ticketed, booted, or towed, which strips people of their only remaining shelter.
I want to focus on Newark's municipal code for a second.
Yeah.
Because the physics of this rule just stopped me in my tracks. They have an ordinance restricting people from idling a vehicle for heat to a maximum of 15 consecutive minutes when it is below freezing outside.
And 15 minutes is barely enough time to even warm the cabin of a standard car, let alone keep it warm for the night.
Right. It is like forcing someone to hold their breath underwater but in the freezing cold. You surface, you turn the engine on for a tiny gasp of warm air, and the law forces you right back into the freezing temperatures. How is anyone supposed to survive a sub-freezing night in 15-minute increments?
That exact tension between human survival and municipal law is actually playing out in the state legislature right now. Representative Sophie Phillips introduced House Bill 135 and House Bill 454.
Okay, what do those do?
They're collectively known as the Anti-Cruelty to Delawareans Experiencing Homelessness Act. The goal of this legislation is to explicitly allow life-sustaining activities like sitting, standing, or sleeping in public spaces, provided it doesn't create a direct hazard.
Got it.
Specifically, if no adequate alternative shelter has been offered by the state.
But there is massive friction around this bill. To look at it impartially from the advocate side, they argue that handing out fines and towing vehicles just creates deeper legal and financial barriers. I mean, it criminalizes the unavoidable biological need to sleep.
Right.
On the flip side, you have local businesses, realtors, and lawmakers, including the governor's office, who fear that restricting local enforcement will invite civil rights lawsuits against small towns, and that legally protecting public encampments will damage commercial districts.
It is a fundamental clash. You have the civil rights and physical safety of vulnerable individuals on one side, and the enforcement priorities and economic concerns of local municipalities on the other.
Given this intense legislative friction and localized criminalization, based on this, the current draft score is... Wait, let's pause right here. For everyone listening, I want you to picture a preliminary scorecard in your mind right now. We're going to put up our first numbers.
And you will clearly see this labeled as the draft score.
Yes, I want to emphasize to you directly, this is absolutely not the final score. Do not lock this number in. We still have 3 massive categories left to cover, diving into the reality of vehicle living and grassroots outreach, and I promise you, what we are about to discuss may significantly change the final result.
So let's transition logically into the 4th category, vehicle dwelling friendliness. As we just discussed, if public spaces are heavily criminalized and shelters are at capacity, people naturally retreat to their cars. It is the very last physical barrier between them and the elements.
But how friendly is Delaware to someone whose only home is their vehicle?
It is essentially entirely hostile. Delaware has a complete lack of state-sanctioned safe parking programs. To give you some contrast, if you look at a state like California, various municipalities run programs offering gated lots with nighttime security, sanitation stations, and on-site case management so people can sleep without fear.
And in Delaware?
If you check Delaware's 211 resource registry today, there are 0 active safe parking programs listed in the entire state.
So where do people actually go? Because the lived reality of just trying to find a safe spot to close your eyes sounds exhausting.
It's a constant shuffle.
We looked into the Middletown Walmart, for example. Historically, Walmart parking lots were a safe haven for people living in vehicles. But that specific location has officially banned overnight parking. So people try highway rest areas,
which are equally precarious. The Smyrna Rest area has explicit no camping signs posted and actively limits vans to 6 hours.
6 hours isn't even a full night's sleep.
No, it's not. If you try the I-95 Welcome Center, there are no time limits, but it is incredibly noisy, heavily trafficked by massive semi-trucks at all hours, and just completely unsafe for setting up a quiet, secure sleep space.
You are constantly on the move, constantly burning expensive gas, and constantly risking a ticket or a tow. With 0 state infrastructure to protect people sleeping in their cars, this lowers the overall picture.
Which brings us to a fascinating turning point in our evaluation. Category 5 is outreach and social services, and here we see a really stark contrast.
Yeah, this part was wild.
On one hand, you have significant administrative and data collection failures at the state level. On the other, you have this incredible boots-on-the-ground dedication from the local community.
What blew my mind in the research was the state's 2026 data collection failure. You would think state policy requires rigorous data, but tell us how a single weather event dismantled the entire count.
It was a massive operational snafu during the 2026 point-in-time count. Normally, volunteers and officials fan out across the state to physically count and survey people living in cars, in the woods, and in tents.
Right.
But there was a blizzard warning right before the scheduled count. This led to a complete breakdown in planning, and the unsheltered portion of the count was entirely canceled. They only managed to count the people who were already inside shelters.
And we have to explain why that matters so much. Federal funding from HUD, as well as local state policy decisions, are directly tied to those numbers. So state lawmakers are basically making critical funding decisions while flying completely blind, relying on outdated, unsheltered data from previous years.
Yeah, exactly. The systemic apparatus failed. But contrast that with the grassroots outreach we saw. Despite the state's data failure, you had dedicated community volunteers out in the field doing the heavy lifting. Groups like the outreach team from Brandywine Counseling, we are talking about volunteers physically trudging through rain-soaked, muddy woods in Kent County at 10 o'clock at night.
Handing out drawstring bags filled with life-saving essentials, right? Narcan, hand warmers, first aid kits.
Yes.
But the sources also noted something heartbreaking about those interactions. Volunteers talked about approaching tents deep in the woods and being met with total silence. People were actively hiding in their own tents, holding their breath, because recent local media scrutiny had made them terrified of being displaced or arrested by police.
It really highlights the deep mistrust that forms when enforcement outpaces assistance.
It is just a brutal irony. The state apparatus couldn't mobilize to count its most vulnerable citizens because of the weather, but local volunteers are out there in the freezing mud trying to save lives. Thanks to these dedicated community volunteers, this raises the overall picture.
Which leads us perfectly to our sixth and final category, pathways to permanent housing. And there is one ultimate case study that perfectly illustrates Delaware's systemic bottlenecks going head-to-head with its community innovation. It is a project called Tharos Village.
This was fascinating to read about. What exactly is Tharos Village?
It was a community built in Lewis, situated right on the demolished lot of the former Delaware State Police Troops 7 barracks. When that building came down, unhoused people who had been sheltering nearby scattered into the woods.
Oh, yeah.
So the advocacy group Code Purple petitioned the state and created a highly structured, self-governed tent community for 28 individuals on that empty lot.
And it is vital to note this wasn't just a free-for-all encampment. The structure was rigorous.
Very rigorous. Residents had to sign strict behavioral contracts to stay there. They received dedicated on-site case management from Brandywine Counseling to help them secure jobs and transition into permanent housing.
That's amazing.
And the broader community really rallied behind the initiative. A waste management company called Casella donated dumpsters for proper sanitation. BB Healthcare provided medical checkups for the residents. A local bike shop even donated bicycles so residents had a reliable way to commute to their coastal jobs.
It sounds like an incredible blueprint for success. It was a tangible pathway that was actually working, allowing employed, unhoused individuals to stabilize for 45 days. So why aren't we seeing Tharos villages everywhere? What was the roadblock?
Bureaucratic red tape. Despite its massive success in stabilizing people, the project stalled hard when advocates tried to reopen it for the following spring. They immediately hit a wall of Sussex County zoning hurdles and conditional use approvals.
Of course.
Simultaneously, a state land use study began, and officials started debating whether to just sell the land for revenue or let the Department of Transportation use the lot to store winter road salt.
They were literally debating whether to house human beings or store road salt.
Yeah.
This clash between grassroots innovation and bureaucratic red tape means this shifts the score.
All right, we have walked through all 6 categories. Let's step back and synthesize everything we have uncovered in this deep dive for the final evaluation.
When we look at Delaware's major strengths, it is undeniably the people on the ground. The incredible grassroots initiatives like Tharos Village and the relentless Code Purple volunteers are doing the heavy lifting where the state falls short.
Absolutely.
We also see bold legislative attempts like HB 135 trying to push back and decriminalize basic human survival.
But the major weaknesses are systemic, deeply entrenched, and severe. There is a catastrophic bottleneck in housing assistance, with over 86% of households calling for emergency help being turned away. We see highly punitive municipal codes aggressively targeting vehicles, pushing people further into the margins, and critical data collection failures like the canceled 2026 unsheltered PIT count leave the state fundamentally unequipped to understand the very crisis it is trying to solve.
So it's time to assign the specific grades. For housing affordability, based on that 86% rejection rate and the lack of workforce housing, it has to be an F. The bottleneck is simply too massive to ignore.
I agree completely. For shelter access, given the strict $1,200 financial caps on vouchers and the reliance on seasonal weather to trigger Code Purple, I'd give it a D. The safety net is just too conditional.
Criminalization and enforcement gets an F. The fines, the midnight parking bans, and the 15-minute idling restrictions are relentless.
Vehicle dwelling friendliness is also an F. With 0 state-sanctioned free parking programs, there is no safe harbor for someone in their car.
But for outreach and social services, thanks entirely to those boots on the ground trudging through the mud, that earns a solid B.
And for pathways to permanent housing, projects like Tharos Village show incredible promise and innovation, but they are suffocated by zoning and red tape. Let's call that a C.
Taking all that into account, tallying up the systemic failures against the community triumphs, the final perfectly homeless state score for Delaware is a 38 out of 100.
That 38 really reflects a state caught in a deep, unresolved tension. You have localized criminalization and bureaucratic hurdles actively fighting against the desperate need for systemic housing reform and the incredible compassion of local volunteers.
That's the perfectly homeless state score for Delaware. But here's the bigger question. would you go to perfectlyhomeless.com and click the Buy Me a Coffee link?
Oh,
Small donation will really help. Let me know in the comments. And if there's a state you'd like to see next, tell me below. This is a 50-state journey through how America actually treats people without housing, and every state tells a different story. If you'd like to support the project, visit the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and pick up a Perfectly Homeless hoodie. Every purchase helps fund future episodes and keeps these stories in front of the public. Wear the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore. It's happening in every state, every city, and more neighborhoods than most people realize. Until next time, dwell well, and we'll see you in the next state.